The warning beacons had drifted at the edge of the solar system for 10,000 years. They were enormous slabs of metal, each one wider than a mountain and taller than a skyscraper, held in place by a technology so ancient that no living engineer in the galaxy could fully explain how they stayed fixed in space. Every slab was carved with deeply etched inscriptions in more than 400 languages spoken across the known galaxy. Some of those languages belonged to empires that no longer existed. Some belonged to species that had gone silent long ago. But every single inscription, in every single language, said exactly the same thing. Do not enter this system. Do not disturb the planet within. Do not wake what sleeps here. Turn around, leave. Do not come back. Commander Vizslos of the Galactic Dominion read the nearest marker from the bridge of his flagship, tilted his long gray head to one side, and ordered his fleet to advance. He was not, by nature, a reckless creature. In fact, he was quite intelligent. He had earned his rank through years of careful planning and successful campaigns in the outer sectors. He had read history. He knew that the quarantine on this system was ancient, placed here at the tail end of an era most modern citizens of the Dominion regarded as mythology rather than genuine history. And that was exactly why he wasn't worried. In his experience, mythology was simply old fear dressed up in dramatic language. Whatever had frightened the people who built these markers was long gone. Thousands of years had passed. The universe had moved on. His fleet consisted of 47 warships of varying sizes, well-armed, well-crewed, well-supplied. Their mission was simple: reach the third planet in this quiet system, scan it for valuable mineral deposits, and begin the early phases of resource extraction. The Dominion needed materials for its expansion projects, and this planet, tucked into a forgotten corner of the Orion Arm, had shown promising readings on long-range sensors. The quarantine, Vizslos had decided, was an obstacle, and obstacles existed to be overcome. His science officer, a small, cautious creature named Pell, said nothing when he gave the order to proceed. She simply turned back to her console and opened the system's archive file. She had already read it twice that morning. Now she read it a third time, going slowly through each line. When she reached the final paragraph, the one describing the wake condition, she closed her eyes for a moment, opened them again, and said nothing more. There was nothing useful to say. The order had already been given. The third planet appeared on the main display, and even Vizslos paused to look at it. It really was beautiful, blue and green and white, wrapped in slowly turning clouds that glowed softly against the black. It looked peaceful. It looked gentle. From this distance, it looked exactly like the kind of quiet, undeveloped world that made for a simple extraction mission. Vizslos ordered a standard orbital survey to map the surface geology. The results came back quickly, showing rich mineral deposits spread across several continental regions. He studied the map and selected 3 uninhabited wilderness zones as test sites. A low-yield bombardment pulse at each location would confirm the depth and quality of the deposits. Standard procedure. Nothing excessive. The pulses fired. They struck the surface with the force of moderate earthquakes, shaking the ground across wide areas. From orbit, the impacts looked small, brief, bright flashes over empty land, there and gone in seconds. On the surface, 10,000 kilometers from the nearest impact site, a human farmer named Dale Hutchkins stood in front of his barn as the ground shifted beneath his boots. He looked down at the dirt, then up at the sky. The horizon was calm. The air was calm, but the ground had moved in a way that felt wrong, not like a natural quake, but like something had pressed down from above. Dale squinted for a long moment at the pale blue afternoon sky. Then he went inside, sat down at his kitchen table, and turned on the television. He was not the only one who had noticed. Within 3 hours, seismic monitoring stations on 6 continents had logged the impacts. Within 5 hours, military radar systems in 4 countries had detected the fleet in high orbit. Within 8 hours, the information had reached the heads of every major government on the planet. There were emergency sessions. There were urgent phone calls. There were a great many people in important rooms speaking in very serious voices. But here was the thing about the people on this small blue planet that no Dominion analyst had thought to include in their briefing. They were remarkably good at setting their differences aside when something threatened all of them at once. The usual arguments, disagreements, and dividing lines that filled the daily headlines didn't disappear entirely. But they slid, with surprising speed, into the background. Within 24 hours, a unified emergency council had formed. Representatives from nations that hadn't cooperated in years sat at the same table, studying the same satellite data, quietly asking the same questions. The first question was, "What is up there?" The second was, "What do we do about it?" Meanwhile, Vizsla had sent a reconnaissance probe down to the planet's surface to collect soil samples and study the local environment. The probe landed in a wide, flat field surrounded by gentle hills and tall grass. A standard scout drone climbed out of it and began its assigned task. 12 minutes later, Dale Hutchins arrived on the field in his old pickup truck. He got out, looked at the blinking probe sitting in the middle of his field, and walked toward it without hesitation. When the scout drone turned to face him, he looked directly into its optical sensor and crossed his arms. "I don't know who sent you," he said, in a voice that was calm and unmistakably serious at the same time, "but you've got about 30 seconds to give me a real good reason why you're sitting on my land." The drone had not been programmed for this kind of response. Its programming accounted for hostile action, flight, or concealment. It had not been prepared for a human in muddy boots who looked mildly irritated and entirely fearless. It hesitated, processing. Dale waited. When no answer came, he acted. He was by nature a practical man. 2 hours later, a Dominion recovery team found the scout drone zip-tied to a wooden fence post at the edge of the field, still blinking steadily. Dale was inside his house, drinking coffee, watching the emergency broadcast on TV. That evening, the newly formed Human Council sent its first message to the fleet in orbit. Pell received it, translated it carefully, and laid it wordlessly on the commander's desk. Vizsla read it. It was short. It was direct. It contained no threats, no dramatic language, and no negotiation. It simply read, "You have 24 hours to explain your presence and your actions in this system. This is an order, not a request. We expect your response." Vizsla read it twice, made a short, dismissive sound, and set it aside. They were a primitive civilization on an isolated planet. They had no starships. They had no weapons capable of reaching orbit. They had nothing. He would deal with them when it suited him. What he did not know, because he had not read the full archive file as closely as Pell had, was that at that very moment, deep in the oldest data vault of the Dominion capital, an ancient AI system was waking from a 10,000-year sleep. It had detected that a quarantine signal had been bypassed without acknowledgement. It checked its records. It confirmed the coordinates of the violated system. And then it sent an automated message to Commander Vizsla's personal command console. "Commander, you have made a grave error. Your fleet has our sympathy." Vizsla didn't discover the message until the next morning. By then, the planet beneath them had already begun to change. The message from the old archive had sat unread on his console for hours. He'd been busy. There were mineral surveys to review, crew reports to sign, and a long communication to send to the Dominion Senate confirming that the mission was proceeding on schedule. The quarantine system had been penetrated without incident. The third planet had been scanned. The deposits were rich and favorably positioned for extraction. Everything was going exactly according to plan. When he finally sat down and opened the message, he read it twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his cabin for a long while. "Your fleet has our sympathy." He told himself it was just an old automated system reacting to an old protocol. Machines didn't understand context. They didn't understand that millennia had passed, that the galaxy was different now, that whatever the original purpose of the warning had been, it surely no longer applied. He closed the message, stood up, and returned to the bridge. Pell was waiting for him. She had been waiting, he noticed, in that specific quiet way she had when she wanted to say something important, but was waiting to be asked. He had worked with her long enough to know the difference between her ordinary silence and this particular kind. "What is it?" he asked. "I want you to read the full archive file," she said. "Not the mission summary, the entire file." "I read the mission summary. It covers everything necessary." "It doesn't," she said. She said it quietly, without any challenge in her voice, just as a fact. "The full file is very different. I think you should read it before we take any further action on the surface." Vizsla looked at her for a moment. Then he told her to send the documents to his console for review later. He had more pressing matters that required his attention. Right now. He did not get to the documents that day. Far away, at the heart of Dominion leadership, they were being examined far more carefully by others. The Senate had received Vizsla's progress report at the same time as an automated warning from the oldest archives, routed through several high-level intelligence channels. A young analyst named Sarah was the first to connect the two. She was young, methodical, and did not yet have the experience needed to simply dismiss uncomfortable facts. She pulled the entire archive record on the quarantine system, made herself a warm drink, and began to read. 3 hours later, she finished. She went straight to the office of Senior Archivist Dahlen, knocked on the door, and set a printed copy of the file on his desk without a word. Dahlen skimmed the first 2 pages, then stood up and hurried directly into the Senate chamber without even putting on his formal coat. The emergency session that followed was anything but calm. The younger senators argued loudly that the quarantine was ancient history, that the archive file was exaggerated, and that Commander Vizsla commanded one of the strongest fleets in the realm. There was nothing on that planet that could threaten them. The older senators, the ones who had devoted their careers to the old records, who remembered the time before the Dominion existed, said nothing. They simply sat in silence until the noise died down. Their silence said more than 1,000 words. When the room finally settled, the oldest senator on the council, a slight, ancient being named Vorath, who rarely spoke in public, placed his hands on the table and said, in a very even voice, that it might help everyone to understand exactly what the archive file described. The file described this. 12,000 years ago, the third planet of the quarantine system had not been a quiet, primitive world at all. It had been home to a civilization that had already reached the stars. They had mastered spaceflight for centuries, long before the Ket sovereignty, the empire that predated the Dominion, had ever made contact with them. They built ships. They explored the outer systems. They formed alliances, established trade, and expanded their influence steadily and quickly. And they fought 3 interstellar wars. In each of these conflicts, they were the smaller side. In every engagement, the opposing civilization was older, better equipped, and more experienced in large-scale conflict. And in every war, the humans, as they were called in the archives, won. Not without heavy losses, not easily, but completely. In every case, the war ended with the other side requesting terms. In every case, the humans accepted those terms without cruelty, rebuilt what had been destroyed, and went home. The Ket sovereignty had studied these 3 wars meticulously. Their analysts had built projections, developed models, tried to figure out exactly what made these humans so difficult to defeat. The models kept returning the same answer, and it was not the answer the analysts expected. It wasn't superior technology. It wasn't greater numbers. It wasn't even a particularly brilliant strategy, though human strategists were very good. It was something simpler and far harder to counter. The humans did not give up. In conventional warfare, every civilization had a breaking point, a level of loss or pressure at which continuing to fight became irrational, and retreat or surrender became the logical choice. Every military model in the galaxy was built on this principle. You applied enough force, caused enough damage, and eventually the other side calculated that continuing wasn't worth it. That was how wars ended. The humans didn't calculate it that way. When they took losses, they didn't slow down. They rebuilt and came back. When a strategy stopped working, they didn't retreat to regroup. They changed the strategy immediately and kept going. When they were pushed to the edge, they didn't collapse. They became more focused, more creative, and more determined than they had been before the pressure started. Every model the Ket's sovereignty built to predict their behavior eventually failed, because every model assumed a breaking point that never arrived. The Ket's sovereignty launched a full military campaign against the humans before they could grow any stronger. The campaign was meant to be decisive and swift. It lasted 400 years. It ended when the Ket's sovereignty sent a message asking for peace, not because they had surrounded the humans, not because they had won some final, decisive battle. They asked for peace because they were exhausted down to the foundations of their civilization, and the humans were not. Humanity had fought for 4 centuries and had, if anything, only gotten better at it. The peace agreement was carefully negotiated. The humans made an offer that historians still find puzzling to this day. They would withdraw completely. They agreed to deactivate their spaceflight technology, to gradually erase their memory of galactic civilization across generations, and to place their world under a long quarantine. In exchange, they asked only to be left in peace. The Ket's sovereignty agreed that same day. The archive noted, in a brief and almost offhand sentence, that several historians believed the humans hadn't accepted this arrangement out of exhaustion or defeat, but because they had gotten bored. The war no longer offered new challenges. They had solved it. It was time to do something else. One final detail was in the file, a line Sarah had underlined during her first reading, and which now sat at the center of every Senate debate. The regression, the memory loss, the technological suppression, had never been meant to be permanent. It was closer to a long sleep than to death, and clearly stated in the original treaty both sides had agreed to was a single condition under which that sleep would end: external aggression on home territory. Voreth looked around the room after reading that line aloud. No one spoke. Then Sarah, who had followed the senior archivist into the session and stood quietly at the back wall, said, in a low, deliberate voice, "The orbital bombardment has already happened." After that, there was a long silence in the room. On the blue planet below them, a retired aerospace engineer named Dr. Juna Park woke at 3 in the morning from a deep, vivid dream she couldn't quite remember. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her apartment. Then, without entirely understanding why, she got up, walked into her study, and picked up a marker. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finally stepped back and looked at her whiteboard, it was covered edge to edge with equations, diagrams, and construction notes. Her hands were shaking slightly. She recognized pieces of what she'd written, standard physics, familiar mathematics, but the overall shape of it was something she had never studied, never read, never been taught. It was a design for a faster-than-light propulsion system. She stared at it for a long time, then picked up her phone and called a colleague she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. "I need to show you something," she said. Her voice was quiet and very calm. "I think something's woken up inside me, and I don't think I'm the only one." She wasn't. All across the planet, in dozens of cities, in hundreds of households, other people were waking with the same strange feeling. Something old and forgotten was surfacing. Something that had slept for a very long time was slowly, quietly opening its eyes. 6 months after the first bombardment, the planet below was unrecognizable, not in the way a place looks after destruction, but in the way a place looks when something that had been sleeping inside it has finally stood up and stretched. The cities were the same. The streets, the buildings, the rivers were the same, but the energy running through everything had changed completely. Everything now had a focus, a shared direction, as if hundreds of millions of individual people had suddenly all turned to face the same point on the horizon. Pell watched the surface every morning from the observation deck of the flagship. She'd started doing it without really deciding to. She stood at the wide window with a cup of warm liquid, watching the swirling clouds over the blue-green surface, trying to understand what she was seeing in the long-range scanner feeds. Construction was happening in dozens of places at once. Planet-wide energy production had increased significantly in just a few months. New structures were appearing in remote areas, large, flat, reinforced structures that the Dominion's pattern recognition systems kept trying to classify and kept failing to. They looked like launch platforms. She reported this to Vizsla. He looked at the scans, dismissed them as industrial expansion, and reminded her that the humans had no knowledge of spaceflight. They were a pre-contact civilization. Whatever they were building, it was no threat to a fleet in high orbit. Pell returned to her console and said nothing, but she began quietly keeping a personal log of everything the scanners recorded. She had a feeling she would want a detailed record later. She wasn't sure why. It was just a feeling. The truth of what was happening on the surface was both simpler and more extraordinary than any Dominion analyst could have guessed. It wasn't a single government program, or a brilliant scientist working in a secret lab. It wasn't organized in any way that was obvious from the outside. It was simply individuals, ordinary people, waking up in the morning with knowledge they hadn't had the night before. During his break, a worker at a large industrial plant sat down, picked up a pen, and sketched a detailed drawing for an energy converter, though he had never learned how such a thing worked. A young woman, studying at a coastal university, filled 6 notebooks in a single weekend with mathematical proofs no one had ever taught her, checked her results for 2 days, and found that all of it was correct. A retired military engineer in a northern country woke from a strange, long dream and immediately began drafting hull armor designs lighter and more resilient than anything currently in production. The phenomenon spread everywhere and kept accelerating. Whatever had been suppressed in the human mind 12,000 years ago was returning now, like water rushing back with tremendous force and no warning the moment a clogged pipe suddenly clears. Not slowly, not hesitantly, but all at once, with immense power. The Unified Emergency Council, which had met daily since the first bombardment, received reports from every corner of the planet. Scientists, engineers, and designers presented new concepts at a pace that was impossible to track. The council made a pragmatic decision early on. Instead of trying to direct everything from the top, they set up a simple open system where anyone with a useful idea could submit it. Teams formed quickly around the most promising proposals, and resources were distributed according to actual effectiveness rather than rank or status. It was chaotic and led to fierce arguments, but it also enabled a speed that a more tightly controlled approach would never have achieved. The scout drone Dale Hutchins had found in his field ended up, 2 weeks after the council's founding, in a state research facility. Within weeks, a team of engineers from 6 countries with backgrounds ranging from aerospace to farm equipment repair had fully disassembled the device, understood exactly how it worked, and begun building a version of its propulsion system out of materials available on Earth. They failed on the first attempt. They failed on the third. But after 4 months, they had a working engine. After 5 months, they had functional shields based on the same principles as the Dominion fleets. After 6 months, they had weapons, and the mood in the research facilities had shifted from urgent to something quieter and more serious. There is a detail the archive file left out, one that Sarah only learned much later, from a young Dominion soldier who chose to leave his post rather than fire another shot. His name was Kest, and he had served on one of the escort ships assigned to guard the fleet's supply lines. He was not an important man. He held no rank worth mentioning, and no one on the bridge would have known his name. What Kest noticed, in the months following the first bombardment, was smaller and quieter than the battles that would come later. He noticed that the crew stopped joking during their shifts. He noticed that veteran officers, who had served in a dozen campaigns without hesitation, began double-checking orders they would once have executed without a second thought. He noticed that Pell's private logs, which she thought no one else read, had started circulating quietly among the lower decks, passed hand to hand like something forbidden, because in them was written, plainly, what the fleet's own instruments were seeing and what the commander refused to act on. Kest read one of those logs during a night shift when no one else was on the deck. He read about the launch platforms. He read about the energy signatures rising, week over week, in a curve that had no plateau. He read Pell's short, careful note at the bottom. I do not believe we understand what we are standing in front of. He did not become a hero. He did not sabotage his ship or turn against his commanders. He simply began, very quietly, keeping his own record of what he saw: dates, numbers, small decisions made by people higher up the chain who chose comfort over caution. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was only being careful. But some part of him already understood that he was building something he would need later. An honest account of how a fleet walked, in full daylight, eyes open, into a mistake it had been warned about 10,000 years in advance. When the war ended, it was accounts like his, small, unglamorous, unheroic, that historians on both sides would rely on to understand not just what happened, but how so many intelligent people had managed to convince themselves, for so long, that the warning didn't apply to them. Vizsla, who by now had received a very pointed message from the Senate urging extreme caution, chose instead to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. He selected a cluster of communication satellites in high orbit and ordered their destruction. It was a controlled action, he told himself, a show of strength, a reminder of the power gap between a spacefaring empire and a planet that had only just rediscovered basic propulsion technology. 3 human technicians performing maintenance on one of the satellites were killed in the attack. The Human Council's response came within 4 hours. It was unemotional. It was not dramatic. It was a short, precise statement that named the 3 dead by name, stated clearly that the action was considered an act of aggression against human life, and informed the fleet that, as of that moment, the Council considered itself in a state of active conflict with the Galactic Dominion. After that, every communication channel went very quiet. Pell read the statement 3 times. Its tone unsettled her more than any threat could have. There was no anger in it. There was no fear. It was simply a calm, clear line being drawn, and on the other side of that line, something very purposeful was preparing to act. Sarah made her decision that same night. She had been an archivist in the Dominion's Military Intelligence Division for 4 years. She was not a soldier, and she was not a hero. She was a careful, precise, slightly anxious person who had spent most of her career reading old documents in quiet rooms, but she had read the full archive file. She had been in the Senate chamber when Voreth read the wake condition aloud. And she had spent 6 months watching every warning in that file arrive, one after another, while the commander of the fleet dismissed each one. She packed a small bag, wrote a short note explaining her decision, and boarded an emergency escape pod. She set it for the surface of the planet below and launched before she could change her mind. The pod shook violently during descent, and she spent the entire trip with her eyes closed and her hands clamped around the safety restraints, wondering if she had just made the last decision of her life. She landed hard in a barren, icy, rocky landscape she would later learn was called Iceland. The impact was hard enough to knock her briefly unconscious. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the gray sky through the cracked window of the pod and several people in thick coats standing outside, watching her with expressions that were curious rather than hostile. They helped her out of the pod, wrapped her in a heavy blanket, and handed her a warm drink that smelled strange but was surprisingly comforting. Then they drove her to a low building, where a calm, elegantly dressed man was waiting for her at a table with 2 chairs. His name was Ambassador Chen Wei. He introduced himself simply, asked if she needed anything before they talked, and then waited patiently. He didn't push her. He didn't raise his voice. He sat with the easy patience of someone who had all the time in the world, which Sarah found more unsettling than any aggressive interrogation could have been. She told him everything she knew: the archive file, the Senate session, the wake condition, the full size of the Dominion fleet. She explained that Vizslos commanded only a reconnaissance force, a small advance element. The Dominion's full military numbered over 4,000 warships. She wanted him to understand the scale of what was coming. Chen Wei listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he folded his hands on the table and said calmly, without any visible emotion, "That's useful to know. We were worried this might get resolved too quickly." Sarah stared at him. She had expected fear. She had expected the number 4,000 to produce some visible reaction, alarm, urgency, at least a change in his expression. There was nothing, just the same calm, steady attention. She spent the rest of the day in a small room with a window overlooking a gray, windy landscape, drinking warm drinks and wondering, very seriously, whether switching sides had actually been the right call. 3 weeks later, the first human spacecraft launched. It had started life as a cargo hauler, a large, clunky, thoroughly unglamorous vessel that had spent its working years moving industrial equipment between ports. Its crew had stripped it down to the frame, reinforced the hull with new armor plating, mounted 6 railguns at angles no professional military designer would ever have approved, and installed the new propulsion system in a space that was really too small for it. The whole thing looked exactly like what it was, something built very quickly by people who were determined and creative and didn't much care how it looked. The 11-person crew who volunteered to fly it were a mix of former military pilots, engineers, and a farmer from Montana who, in the months since tying an alien drone to a fence post, had become something of a celebrity. His name was Dale Hutchkins. He'd been asked, quite formally, whether he wanted to be part of the first crew. He'd said yes without hesitation, then gone home to feed his horses and pack a bag. The crew named the ship before launch. They painted the name in big, bold, cheerful letters across the hull, "The Stubborn Bastard." The council objected to the name on grounds of professionalism. The crew listened politely and kept the name anyway. The Stubborn Bastard launched on a clear morning and reached the outer solar system within a few hours. 2 Dominion warships were patrolling the edge of the system. They picked up the human ship on long-range scans and immediately classified it as a primitive, improvised vessel. The patrol commander sent a short, dismissive note to the flagship and set an intercept course. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, both Dominion warships were drifting, disabled. The Stubborn Bastard had taken damage to its port side, and one of its guns had stopped working. The crew was intact. Dale Hutchkins, who had run the targeting system, sent a short message back to the surface. Within hours, it had become one of the most repeated lines on the planet. 2 down, tell them to send more. On the Dominion flagship, Vizslos stared at the battle report for a long time in silence. Then he went to his private cabin, sat at his console, and finally, 6 months later than he should have, opened the full archive file. He read it from beginning to end without stopping. When he finished, he sat in the silence of his cabin and stared at the wall. Outside the window, the beautiful blue-green planet turned slowly in the dark. He understood now what Pell had been trying to tell him. He understood what the markers at the edge of the system had meant. He understood why no one had entered this system in 10,000 years. And he understood with a cold, sinking certainty that he had no idea what to do next. 2 years after the initial attacks, the Galactic Dominion committed its full military force. The order came after weeks of heated debate, straight from the Senate floor. The older senators had argued against it. Vorath had stood at the front of the chamber and delivered long speeches about patience, about the archive files, and about the specific, well-documented reasons why direct military escalation against this particular planet had historically been an extremely poor idea. The younger senators had listened, weighed his arguments carefully, and voted for military expansion anyway. They had the numbers. They radiated confidence. In their view, they had more than enough ships. 4,200 warships gathered at the edge of the quarantine zone. They formed a long, staggered formation stretching across thousands of kilometers of space. It was the largest military force the Dominion had assembled in 3,000 years. Supply ships moved along the edges of the formation. Medical and repair units took positions toward the rear. Troop transports held ground forces ready for surface operations once the orbital engagement was finished. Every projection, every model, every military analyst who reviewed the assembled force agreed on one point: this would be over quickly. The human fleet that met them numbered 600 ships. When the Dominion's long-range sensors confirmed that number, there was genuine confusion on several bridges. Analysts counted the ships twice, then a third time. The ratio was so lopsided that some commanders initially speculated the humans were planning something other than a direct engagement, perhaps a diversion, while something else happened elsewhere. But the 600 ships approached steadily, without hesitation, on a direct intercept course. It soon became clear the humans had simply brought what they had. What followed became known later as the Battle of Ulan, named for the distant rock-and-ice belt at the outer edge of the solar system, where the two fleets first met. It lasted 11 days. It was not the short, clean engagement the Dominion's planners had prepared for. In the first 2 days, the Dominion's numerical advantage was clear and decisive. Human ships took heavy hits. Formations broke apart. Several of the larger human vessels were destroyed in the opening engagements, and Dominion commanders watching the battle feeds felt the steady, comfortable certainty of a force doing exactly what it had been trained to do. The projection was that the human fleet would suffer critical losses by the 3rd day and begin retreating by the 4th. The 3rd day arrived. The human fleet did not retreat, it reorganized. This was the part that increasingly unnerved the Dominion officers watching from their command ships. When a human formation was broken apart by an attack, the surviving ships didn't drift aimlessly, scatter, or wait for orders from a command vessel. They found each other. They formed new groups. They identified the nearest Dominion ships and attacked immediately with whatever they had, adjusting their tactics to the immediate situation instead of waiting for a plan from above. When a human command ship was destroyed, and this happened more than once in those difficult early days, the surrounding ships didn't hesitate and didn't lose coordination. They simply kept going. The losses were real and significant, but they didn't trigger the structura. Collapse the Dominion's models had predicted. The humans had designed their fleet to keep functioning even without central command. They had priced in their own losses before the battle even began. By the 5th day, Dominion Command had stopped consulting their predictive models. The forecasts kept being wrong, and checking them had become more frustrating than useful. On the 6th day, a human tactic appeared that no Dominion analyst had modeled. A large portion of the human fleet, roughly a third of the remaining ships, began to withdraw, not in a disorganized retreat, but in a controlled, deliberate pullback that drew a significant portion of the Dominion fleet forward, away from its main formation. Dominion commanders read this as a break in human resolve. The order was given to press the advantage and pursue. The pursuing force flew for several hours in what seemed like a smooth, uncontested chase. Then, from 6 different directions, human ships that had been sitting dark and silent in the surrounding space came alive all at once. The trap closed from every side simultaneously. The pursuing Dominion force found itself in the center of a kill zone that had been prepared hours before the retreat began, at positions that required precise coordination and a willingness to leave a large number of ships sitting passively through the most intense part of the battle. Carrying out a plan like that required a very specific quality, a willingness to accept significant short-term losses, allowing your own ships to be hit and destroyed during the withdrawal phase, in the firm belief that the long-term outcome would justify it. Every military model in the Dominion's database rated the probability of a numerically inferior force attempting such a tactic at under 1%. The models assumed no rational commander would order their own people into a deliberate punishing retreat as part of a conscious plan. Those models, however, had been built without any real understanding of the specific psychology of the species they were now facing. By the 8th day, Vizsla stood on his bridge with the expression of a creature who had understood something just slightly too late, looking at the display in front of him. His fleet was not shattered. It was still large and it was still fighting, but it no longer controlled the engagement in any meaningful way. Everywhere his commanders tried to force an advantage, it turned against them. Everywhere they expected the humans to break, the humans held. Everywhere they created a gap, something came through it that made the gap worse. Sarah was in the human command center on the planet's surface, watching the same battle from the other side. She stood beside Ambassador Chen Wei at a long display table covered in shifting tactical data, watching the readouts with wide eyes and very steady hands. She had known intellectually what the archive file said about human warfare. She had read the words. She had understood them as facts on a page, but watching it happen in real time was something else entirely. She turned to Chen Wei and said quietly, "Every other species, when it goes to war, asks whether it can win." Chen Wei glanced at the display for a moment before answering. "Losing isn't something we spend much time planning for. Offer them peace." The night staff who received the message sat on it for 20 minutes before deciding to wake Vorath. They chose him because he had warned them. They chose him because, of every member of the Senate, he was the one who had read the file, understood it, and said so out loud when it might still have made a difference. They knocked on the door of his private quarters, handed him the printed message, and waited. He read it once, then nodded slowly, the way someone nods when something they had expected finally arrives. He asked them to convene an emergency session for sunrise. Then he went back inside and did not sleep again that night. The session the next morning was different from any that had come before. The arguments had mostly gone quiet. The confidence that had filled the chamber 2 years earlier, when the fleet had been assembled and the projections cited, and the older senators politely ignored, had entirely drained away. What remained was a room full of tired, sober beings who had spent 2 years watching their most powerful military force slowly grind to a halt against a planet that had started the conflict without a single ship. The vote to open peace negotiations was decisive. It took 3 weeks to find a neutral location for the talks. A small station orbiting a quiet, unremarkable star, roughly halfway between Earth and the Dominion capital, was selected and prepared. Medical personnel were stationed there. Catering was arranged. A large, formal meeting room was set up with a long table, many chairs, and excellent lighting. The Dominion delegation that arrived filled most of those chairs. There were senior senators, military advisors, legal specialists, diplomatic translators, and a security team that occupied its own separate section of the station. The full Dominion delegation numbered just over 200 people. The human delegation arrived the next morning. There were 3 of them. They boarded the station without any visible security escort, without a long list of advisors, and without any particular ceremony. They were dressed simply and neatly. They walked through the station's corridors at an easy pace, looking around with open, relaxed curiosity, and took their seats at the table with the calm of people settling into a meeting they had scheduled themselves. One of them poured water from a pitcher into 3 cups and handed one to each of his colleagues before anyone else in the room had spoken a word. The 200 members of the Dominion delegation watched this in complete silence. Several of them later described the same feeling in their personal reports of the event. A deep, specific unease that had nothing to do with any visible threat, and everything to do with the quiet certainty radiating from the three people sitting calmly on the other side of the table. One Dominion security specialist noted that evening that he had spent his entire career assessing danger and had never once in his life felt as uneasy in a room as he did in that moment. Ambassador Chen Wei led the talks. He was the same man who, 2 years earlier, had sat across from Sarah in Iceland, offering her warm drinks and patient conversation. He brought the same qualities to the negotiating table: a complete, unshakable calm, a willingness to listen to everything, and an absolute clarity about what he would accept and what he would not. The Dominion's opening proposal was detailed and carefully constructed. It included fleet size limits, territorial boundaries, a timeline for human technological development meant to ensure controlled expansion, and a revised quarantine arrangement described, in the legal language of the document, as a mutual protective measure for both parties. Chen Wei listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. When it ended, he was quiet for a moment. Then he thanked the presenting senator for the thoroughness of the proposal and rejected, point by point, every condition that limited humanity's freedom of movement, construction, expansion, or defense. He did this without raising his voice. He did it without any visible frustration or impatience. He simply laid out in clear and direct language what was acceptable and what was not. Nothing in his manner suggested that further argument would change his position. The negotiations lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, both sides signed. The agreement was named the Ulan Accord after the site of the earlier engagement. It was not written in the language of surrender. It was not a list of restrictions imposed on a defeated side. It was a membership document, a formal agreement admitting humanity as a full and equal partner into the galactic community, with all the rights and responsibilities that status carried. No fleet limits, no expansion timeline, no quarantine, reformed or otherwise. Instead, it included a mutual defense clause, a framework for trade and communication, and a shared commitment to resolving future conflicts peacefully. In several important respects, it was a better agreement for both sides than the Dominion's original proposal had ever offered. Several Dominion member species quietly sent diplomatic messages to Earth before the ink on the accord had even fully dried. Everyone understood which direction the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, and everyone wanted to be on the right side of it going forward. Vizsla attended the signing at Chen Wei's personal request. He had not been brought to the station as a prisoner or under guard, but as an invited guest. He sat toward the back of the room and watched the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who had been part of something significant and was still trying to grasp its exact meaning. He looked older than he had 2 years earlier, somehow smaller, not weakened exactly, but changed in the way certain experiences permanently mark a person. After the documents were signed and the room began to clear, Chen Wei crossed the room and stopped in front of him. He extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting and respect, one Vizsla had studied but never experienced firsthand. Vizsla returned the handshake. "Why did you want me here?" he asked. His voice was steady but genuine. He really wanted to know. Chen Wei thought for a moment. "Because you were the beginning of this," he said. "Whatever it becomes. The trade, the cooperation, the conversations we'll have with the rest of the galaxy from here on, it starts the moment you flew past those markers. You made a mistake, but the outcome of that mistake isn't a bad one, at least. From where I stand," he paused, "the universe is a more interesting place than it was 3 years ago. You deserve to see how this chapter begins." Vizsla had no answer for that. He stood there, letting Chen Wei's words settle, and looked around the room. Dominion senators were speaking with human diplomats. Sarah was talking with a young human engineer by the window. Every kind of species, face, and language filled the same space without tension. And he thought that the old archivist inside him could, despite everything he had lived through, still appreciate something genuinely rare. A new chapter, written in a well-lit room, at a long table, with 3 glasses of water poured with quiet confidence by people who had never, for a single moment, doubted how the story would end. Far away, in the oldest archive vault of the Dominion's Capitol building, a room that had existed longer than most civilizations, untouched by any living being, the archivist system K1 finished its update. It combed through its records systematically, as it always had. The quarantine marker was removed from the system's coordinates. The threat classification was lifted. Contact status, diplomatic standing, and military designation were all updated. The system processed each field carefully and correctly, exactly as it had done for thousands of years with thousands of species before. Then it reached the last field, the one at the end of the record that most species never received an entry for, and wrote the final line. The file was saved. The entry was closed. The system returned to its quiet work in the deep archives of history. The final entry read: Species human, homeworld Sol system, status, active, classification, apex, diplomatic standing, allied. Note to all future civilizations making first contact with this species. Congratulations, you have woken the most dangerous creature in the universe. It does not want to destroy you, it wants to shake your hand. The only thing that matters, the only thing that has ever mattered, is that you offer it first. Epilogue 10 years later. Dale Hutchins never went back to farming full-time, though he kept the land and the horses, and every autumn he flew home to bring in the harvest himself, because he said a man ought to know how to feed himself even if he could also fly a warship. The stubborn bastard sat in a museum orbit now, retired from active service, its dented hull left unrepaired on purpose. Visitors from a dozen species came to see it every year. Most of them stood in front of the crooked, hand-painted name on the hull longer than they stood in front of anything else in the exhibit. Sarah stayed on Earth. She became, over the following decade, one of the primary liaisons between the Human Council and the wider galactic community, not because she sought the position, but because she was, by then, one of the very few people alive who had read the old archive file cover to cover before any of it mattered, and who understood in her bones exactly how close the galaxy had come to a very different outcome. Pell resigned her commission 2 years after the Ulan Accord was signed, and took a position teaching Dominion cadets a new mandatory course, Contact Protocol and Historical Case Studies. Her lectures always began the same way. She would put a single slide on the screen, an image of the ancient warning markers drifting at the edge of a quiet solar system, and ask her class a single question before saying anything else. Why do you think they were still there after 10,000 years, when everyone had stopped believing they mattered? Vizsla never commanded another fleet. He spent his remaining years as a civilian advisor on First Contact Protocol, and he insisted, every single time, on including one line in every briefing he gave, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. Read the entire file, not the summary, all of it, before you decide anything. And on the small blue planet at the center of it all, humanity kept building, not because it had to prove anything anymore, but because, as one particularly plain-spoken senator from the old Ket sovereignty once observed after a long evening of trade talks with a human delegation, it seemed to be simply what they did. They looked at a closed door, decided to see what was on the other side of it, and never once stopped to ask whether they should. The archive file, K1 noted quietly in an addendum no one had requested, and few would ever read, had left out one small detail that turned out to matter more than any of the others. They had never really been asleep at all. They had just been waiting to be needed.